I just want to take a moment to express my empathy for the Somali community and really all immigrant communities and acknowledge the negative attention that they faced, especially because of statements recently made by the current president of America. I think most people can agree that no community deserves to be demonized because of their ethnicity, religion, or country of origin. That's something that we can all agree on, or that most people I would think can agree upon. Many African immigrants, including Somalis, and let me say many immigrants, not just African immigrants, but many immigrants, including Somalis, are navigating really incredibly complex social and political realities, both in the U.S. and in their countries of origin. But I also think there's an important layer that gets left out, especially in the context of the United States. That gets left out in these conversations, and that's the historical experiences of African Americans. Some people may be aware of this information, some people might not. But African Americans have a very particular relationship to citizenship and this concept of belonging in the United States. We were really only legally granted full citizenship with the ratification of the 14th Amendment in what I believe was 1868. And that was just 3 years after slavery was abolished. And that came after centuries, not decades, centuries of forced servitude that began in 1619, when about 20 captive Africans were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. At first, the story goes that they were sort of treated like indentured servants. But very quickly, a system of race-based hierarchy was built, and that resulted in what we call slavery. And this happened long before the United States was even considered a country, when it was officially founded in 1776. So I say this to say that, while many immigrants and immigrant communities arrive in America with some kind of legal pathway, a work permit, a green card, then citizenship after a set number of years, the African American story is a little bit different. Our ancestors did not arrive with visas, sponsors, on immigrant timeline. Our people were treated as what? As property. And sometimes we try to think about it as it was something that happened long ago. But even my personal story tells me that, my great grandfather was what? He was a sharecropper. A sharecropper was what? A step away from being enslaved. Yeah. So I say this to say it took generations of struggles to be recognized as quote unquote citizens on paper. Never mind being treated as just regular human beings in practice in the country that they call the United States of America. And this history is why many of us as African Americans can empathize deeply with communities who are being scapegoated and targeted. And again, this doesn't only include African immigrant communities. I think the African American community empathizes with many immigrant communities as they face a lot of challenges during this current administration. Because we know firsthand what it is to live in a place that calls itself a democracy while denying certain demographics for humanity. But also, I would be remiss not to say that at the same time, we also need to broaden the conversation, because we oftentimes talk about how Western politicians demonize African communities. And we should talk about that, yeah? But what I think is missing is public pressure on the same leaders of the same countries that are described as ravaged, failed, or engulfed in war. You know, what do leaders like Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, the current president of Somalia, what does he have to say about the safety, dignity, and future of their own people, both at home and in the diaspora? And we could name many African leaders whose people have been forced to become migrants in foreign lands, be it for economic migrants or people fleeing out of fear of their lives, you know? You know, where's the accountability for the political, economic, and security decisions that push people to flee their countries in the first place? You know, these are conversations that I think that get lost as different diaspora communities focus on why they belong in America. Yeah. And, I'm not debating whether they belong in America or not. But I think the conversation should also be about what are we doing here, right here in Africa, to guarantee that our people, aren't forced to flee or aren't forced to think that the grass is greener in America, Europe, wherever. Where are those conversations? And I ask these questions out of my own lived experience. Unlike many people who pursued the American dream by coming to the United States, I took a different route. As many people know, I chose the African dream about 17 years ago when I left America for what? For Africa. I've lived and worked all across the continent, including 12 years in one country. And even after living in one country in Africa for 12 years, the majority of the population still considered me what? A foreigner. That's a sad reality. Even after living 12 years in one country, I was still considered a foreigner. So for the small number of us who engage in what I would like to call reverse migration from the West to Africa, there's very little advocacy or public conversations about our realities. Why is that? Maybe it's because when you leave the United States or Europe for Africa, people just automatically assume that you're privileged, yeah? They automatically assume that you're privileged, that your experience doesn't involve struggle, exclusion, or sacrifice. The assumption for many is that if you came from the West, you must just be what? Fine. But many of us are navigating a very real tension, trying to plant roots on a continent, facing bureaucracy, social barriers, and still being viewed as outsiders in the very place that we're trying to reconnect with. And you best believe there's no social safety nets on this side of the pond. As I'm recording this video from where? A beautiful city called Maseru, Lesotho. So for me, I just want to be clear. This isn't about choosing one side over another. Somali versus African American, immigrant versus native, the West versus Africa. It's about holding multiple truths at one time. Most rational people can agree that no community should be demonized because of religion, ethnicity, or nationalities. And we really can all stand in solidarity with communities facing discrimination, and still ask hard questions about leadership, responsibility, and our collective future. Whether you find yourself aspiring for a future in Africa, in America, in Europe, in Thailand, Japan, wherever, that to me is what real love for our people and our homeland looks like. So yeah, that's my meditation for today. Bless up.